UV resin, epoxy resin, UV resin, epoxy resin, UV resin, epoxy resin, UV resin, epoxy resin. Hey, hi! Honestly, I cannot decide. I want to make jewelry, but I don't know which resin to choose. UV resin! Go for UV resin! Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. You want to discover new creative hobbies or just want to have a fun time? Well, you are in the right place. Today we will try to make jewelry with UV resin. As for the epoxy resin, I invite you to watch the video made on this subject to get a better idea on this other technique. Here is the link. Stay tuned until the end because I will share with you the results and most importantly we will do a comparison between these two resins. If you like the video, don't forget to like and to subscribe. UV resin, let's go! In this video, we'll test a different technique. There are many ways to make jewelry with UV resin. I will test the most common one. Of course, there are many others. To harden the resin, I will run each layer under the UV lamp for at least 3 minutes. I could wait only 1 or 2 minutes for clear coats, but at least I'm sure I will not leave any fingerprints. I suggest to start with a technique that I find particularly nice. I will use very thin metal rings like this one. They act as a frame, they retain the resin, allowing to make the first layer. In addition, they are quite pretty. I will show you each steps for the first jewel and then I will go in fast motion for the next one. Let's try now! We now move to a more classic method, the silicone mold. If you have already tried with the epoxy resin, you might have noticed that it is very practical, quick, and it gives excellent results. To your mold! Go! For this last technique, I want to try something different. I will also use silicone mold, but only for the first layer of resin. I will then create a very thin, transparent layer of resin, and then I will work outside the mold. Why? Because I would like to have a very thin, slightly rounded jewelry, like in the first technique, but this time without any metallic rings. I don't know at all if that will work. It's gonna be interesting. Let's see what it does. All we have to do now is to proceed with the assembly. Earring, necklace, pendant, the hardest part is going to be to choose. For the assembly, you will need some drills, but don't use your big drill because your jewelry will not like it. I have tried. Let's get started. I'm done, I did not break anything. You might have already noted some advantages of a UV resin versus the epoxy resin and vice versa. I propose we watch the result and then we talk about the pros and the cons. Ready? Well, it was super fun. As you can see, I tried many combinations, and as for the epoxy resin, the options are endless. In fact, I almost had trouble to make a little rest on my hammock. So we come to the question, UV or epoxy? Conclusion? No choice. Let's go to the comparison table. Let's start with the UV resin. So as you can see, it hardens much faster, only few minutes versus 3 days for the epoxy resin for complete hardening. A significant advantage when you want to make an object, a jewelry for instance, with multiple layers. It is then not necessary to wait 6 hours between each layers of resin as for the epoxy resin. It is obviously not impossible to make multiple layers of resin with the epoxy, but you got it, it may take you more time. Now, getting to the epoxy resin, it is usually cheaper than the UV resin. It of course depends on the brand and the type of resin, but still it remains in general much cheaper than the UV resin. As an example, these two big bottles of epoxy resin cost me the same price than these 2 little bottles of UV resin. UV resin is also very practical due to its more viscous nature. It allowed me, for instance, to put 2 different colors side by side without the risk of mixing them, or to make complex but identical jewelry, very useful for earrings, which might have been less easy with epoxy resin. As you could see, sometimes I even work without mold to obtain a very nice rounded shape that I really liked, and sometimes even on a surface which was not very flat. Even if I should have, you saw I never leveled, and yet the resin did not overflow. So quite a lot of techniques which are possible thanks to this property. As the epoxy resin is more liquid, it will have greater tendency to overflow if the surface is not completely flat. So better to use mold and to make sure that the surface is flat. Now, the fact that the epoxy resin is liquid is also an advantage because it flows very well in the molds, especially when the shape is complex, and I found it very easy to use the epoxy resin with the molds. Getting back to the UV resin, since there is no need to measure two components like for the epoxy resin, I find it much easier to calculate with precision the amount of resin that you need for your project. In addition, it is often presented in a small bottle like that, which I find very practical. So 2 grams,
800 grams.
So try to pour a small amount of epoxy resin for 1 jewel with a bottle of 2 kilos. So yes, of course, there will be smaller bottle of epoxy resin, but usually not at the same price and rarely at the size of this little bottle, which are really practical. So the game is really tight, and I continue with the epoxy resin because it is compatible with the ink, and not any ink, the alcohol ink. And this is great because I love it. The results are amazing, and I will do much more, most probably in the future. The UV resin is incompatible with the ink, unfortunately. I tried and I confirm it does not work. We continue. The use of the UV resin is not as constrained by the weather conditions as the epoxy resin. I tried with cold weather, it works, except not for me, it was really too cold. Un peu trop froid peut-être. Indeed, the epoxy resin will not properly cure when it's too cold, too humid, and even too hot. So UV resin in all weather, well, almost. So back to the epoxy resin, which presents a very interesting advantage, the maximum thickness of the layers. For the epoxy resin, you can pour multiple centimeters at once, depending on the type of resin that you use, where the maximum thickness for the UV resin of each layer is only 3 mm for transparent layer and 1 mm for opaque layer. A really interesting advantage of the epoxy resin. The risk if you exceed the maximum thickness for the UV resin, well, you might get an incomplete hardening and maybe very big bubbles. You can see just here. So epoxy resin will be very good for thick jewelry with big inlays like wood, for instance. Then I'm lost. Which resin should I choose? Well, the answer is simple. Why choose when you can do both? Then, which resin should I choose to make a thick keyring? Epoxy. A very precise jewelry? UV. An opaque pendant or with large inlays? Epoxy. A multi-layer piece of jewelry? UV. Earrings? Well, UV unless you have a design very simple or you don't care having different earrings on both sides. Jewelry with ink. Epoxy. Jewelry using complex molds. Rather epoxy. And what if I want to manufacturing jewelry in winter with snow outside? Why? You understand, the resin depends on the project you plan to do. So I tend to make thinner and more precise jewelry with UV resin and more fun and free creation with epoxy resin. In the end, almost all the techniques are feasible with one or the other. These are obviously my own experiences and my own feelings. You will have certainly many other opinions on the question. I invite you to share them. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and to subscribe to receive new videos. I look forward for your comments. Ciao!